breathing, the one thing that your body can do for the least amount of time. And it all comes down to the fact that your brain is greedy. Your brain has an insatiable desire for ATP to be able to function, and oxygen is necessary in order to be able to undergo cell respiration that's necessary to create that ATP. And so all mammals, being large brain creatures, have developed a large sophisticated physiological system to be able to get the oxygen that's needed as quickly and efficiently as possible. So today we'll be looking a little bit at the ventilation system. Just to go a little bit more into some background, the surface for ventilation needs to occur. It needs to be moist. It needs to be in contact with the circulatory system because the blood is going to be the vehicle by which that oxygen will be transported. And then we also need a large surface area for diffusion to be able to happen on. Some organisms will do this through the skin. So for example, a frog will be able to get a lot of the oxygen that it needs directly through its skin, which again is moist. Some will do it through gills, as in fish, and then others with lungs. So most land animals are going to fall into that category. Now we're going to look most specifically though at the mammalian ventilation system, and more specifically with that, we'll be looking at diagrams containing humans. Now, when we look at some of the parts here, so as we follow the path of oxygen as it comes in, oxygen enters in through the nose and mouth. When it enters the nose, it enters a region called the sinus, and so you have multiple sinus cavities through which air will pass. They will join together in a single tube that will pass into the trachea. The trachea is the tube that is at the front of the throat. So if you feel the front of your throat, you should feel this kind of ridged, semi-rigid tube that is your trachea. And the trachea carries that air down into a pair of lungs. The air will pass into two branches called the bronchioles. So we have a pair of bronchi. Each bronchiole is then going to have a series of alveoli at the end of it. Here you can see the picture of the alveoli. And the alveoli have lots and lots of blood vessels, again, surrounding them to be able to be the place where gas exchange is going to occur. The larynx is the voice box. And so this is a place where a lot of small muscles will control the shape and size of the larynx at any given time, so that we can, in conjunction with the tongue, be able to produce the sounds that we need to. Additionally, the entire length of the respiratory system is covered in cilia. Cilia are these hair-like structures on the exterior of cells that will beat together rhythmically, and in doing so, they will push materials that you might breathe in, solid stuff that you don't want in your body, push it up back towards the mouth. Those are working alongside with mucus. Mucus is created by those cells as a sticky substance that will trap pollution and dust and particles and dirt and the things that you'll breathe in. So those things work together to be able to force all those things out. And when you cough, the coughing is bringing from the top of the trachea up into the mouth a little bit of that mucus that has traveled from the lungs up to the mouth and is ready to be expelled from the body. So that's certainly stuff that you want to get out, to be able to get out of you. Now to look at alveoli, these are this is where surface area is increased. This is the way in which the lung becomes an efficient way to be able to trap oxygen and get it to diffuse into the blood. If it wasn't for these structures, we would not be able to get enough oxygen at a given time. So it's important to remember that the lung is not like a balloon. It's not empty inside, but it's filled with these tiny structures, little clusters of air pockets, and it's in those air pockets where the blood vessels are going to be able to extract oxygen. It's much more efficient than other similar structures in non-mammals and non-land animals that don't have lungs because of that increase in surface area. Capillaries are the blood vessels that surround it. You see that in purple here. And you can see the microscopic image here. The alveoli is these kind of darkened areas where there is nothing, and then they are all surrounded. Those are pockets that will be filled with air that are surrounded by these blood vessels. Now, in terms of the mechanics of how breathing works, there is a muscle that's at the bottom of your rib cage known as the diaphragm. And the diaphragm, just like any muscle, is capable of expanding and contracting. Now, what is unique about the diaphragm is that it is under both automatic and conscious control. So, for the majority of the time, you have no conscious control of the diaphragm, and the lower regions of the brain will automate as needed the contraction of the diaphragm so that you can keep breathing. But if necessary, you can override that automatic system, and you can consciously control how fast or slow, the size of the breaths that you take as needed. When you inhale, the diaphragm contracts. When it contracts, as the arrow shows, it's going to be pulling down on the rib cage, causing expansion of the rib cage outward. That's going to increase the volume of the lungs, and because the volume of the lungs increases, as volume increases, pressure decreases, and that low pressure results in a flow of air into the lungs to fill up that space. When the diaphragm relaxes, it moves back up again. That causes the rib cage to get smaller because volume decreases, pressure increases, and because of that increased pressure, air is going to naturally flow out of the mouth to be able to equalize that pressure with what is outside. All of this is done because pressure is the mechanism by which air is getting in and out. The pressure of the air outside makes a big difference in terms of breathing. So if you're at an extreme high altitude, where the air pressure outside is very low, it becomes much more difficult for the lungs to be able to generate that difference in pressure necessary to get enough oxygen into your body. And so you end up breathing harder, you get winded faster, and you find yourself having trouble being satisfied in terms of getting enough air, particularly when exercising at extremely high altitudes. Now, looking at some of the biochemical related systems in terms of the ventilation system. The first is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a protein. That protein is present in very large amounts in red blood cells. The reason why it's in those red blood cells, which are known as erythrocytes, is because these cells will bind to oxygen preferentially. Now, what you can see in these two graphs is the O2 saturation of hemoglobin is on the y-axis, and on the x-axis is going to be the partial pressure of oxygen. So as the pressure of oxygen increases, the saturation of hemoglobin also increases, and you can notice this nice S-shaped curve that goes along with both of these graphs. So when the pressure of oxygen is very low, then the hemoglobin is going to release the oxygen. So, for example, when oxygen comes into the body, the blood cells that are sent to the lungs have a very low saturation of hemoglobin, but the pressure of oxygen is very high. So you can see the lungs here, it's at 100, and so those hemoglobin are going to load up on that oxygen. Once those things come out to tissues at rest or tissues that are in the process of exercising, there the pressure of oxygen outside of those blood cells is going to be much lower, and so that causes the hemoglobin to release its oxygen into those tissues. Now, here we have in B how pH is related to that. So pH 7.4 versus pH 7.2 changes the ability for hemoglobin to keep and maintain that oxygen. When the pH is low, which happens when there's more carbon dioxide in the blood, the hemoglobin is more likely to give up its oxygen, because if there's a lot of carbon dioxide around, that means that the cell respiration is probably happening at a higher rate in those tissues. So there's a greater need in those tissues for more oxygen. Now, the diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide into and out of the blood is going to be related to how much of each of those two gases there are at that point. So you can see when we breathe in, the amount of oxygen in red is very high. The amount of carbon dioxide is very low. Then at these different points as we travel throughout the systems of the body, getting to the blood tissues at number 5, the concentration of carbon dioxide is increasing, because at these tissues, cell respiration is happening, carbon dioxide is being created. So it's at this point where oxygen levels will now start to decrease in the blood, because the hemoglobin is giving up that oxygen and taking in the carbon dioxide instead. So that carbon dioxide is going to be also carried by hemoglobin, but some of it is also going to dissolve into the blood. So an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase turns the carbon dioxide into carbonic acid. The carbonic acid is converted into bicarbonate ions, and then it stays dissolved in the blood. It'll act as a pH buffer, but if concentrations of carbon dioxide get higher, then that carbonic acid will cause a lowering of the pH in the blood. Now, how the brain controls your breathing is based on the pH of the blood, because the amount of CO2 that's inside of you will cause changes in your blood pH. Now, what's normal is for the brain to be able to register is a slightly basic pH level in the blood. If you are working harder, then your cells are producing more CO2 because they are going through more respiration. More CO2 lowers the blood pH below 7.4. That sends a signal to the brain, particularly the medulla oblongata, to be able to speed up the beating of the heart and to speed up your rate of breathing, because more blood pumping will bring more CO2 to the lungs, and then a greater breathing rate will allow you to get rid of that extra CO2. Now, obviously, as a consequence of breathing faster and your heart beating faster, you're also going to bring in more oxygen. And so if you're working hard, your body is going to need to be able to get that oxygen in to be able to continue respiration. A couple of disorders. The first, asthma. So asthma is going to be a constriction of the bronchioles. So it's the tubes that are linking the trachea into the lungs. Those tubes are going to constrict, and that allows less air to come into the lungs. So that is then going to cause this physiological response of wheezing, and often a panic state in the person who's suffering from it, because they are recognizing that they're not getting as much air as they need, and it causes them to get extremely nervous during that time. There are chemical inhalers that can send signals to those cells to be able to relax. So those cells will relax and open up the airflow again into the lungs. And avoidance of triggers, because in many cases asthma might have a particular cause, some reason why an asthma attack will come on in the person who has it. Emphysema is another common respiratory system disorder. This is a decrease in the surface area of the alveoli, and often pollution and smoking are common causes for it. And because there is less surface area, there's less air coming from the outside into the blood. And so a person is going to be constantly short of breath, because the body is trying to keep up with the need to be able to expel CO2 and bring in more oxygen, but it's just difficult to do so with the amount of alveoli, the amount of healthy alveoli there are in the lungs. In this case, it's chronic, meaning that it's something that doesn't go away, and it is not fixable, short of a lung transplant. And so in some cases, people will need to go onto oxygen and carry oxygen tanks that have an extremely high percentage of oxygen gas in them, just to ensure that the person is getting enough O2 into their body. Okay, again, if you have any questions, please let me know, but that is the ventilation system.